safety. So I cover maternity, whistleblowers, regulation of managers, various like children's care. It can really vary, and it is a very interesting brief. We have in health, it's quite funny because HSJ alumni dominate the health awards. So
Welcome to How to Be a Journalist, a podcast by News Associates. I'm Plamedi Mbungu, and thank you very much for tuning in. I'm a recent university graduate, and I work at News Associates. I'm early in my career, and I need the wisdom from more experienced journalists. So to solve this problem, in every episode, I will dive into conversations with some of the most dedicated and talented journalists from all corners of our industry, asking questions about their careers, successes, and giving you a different view of the person behind the byline. Whether you're an aspiring journalist, a seasoned figure in the newsroom, or just interested in knowing what happens behind the scenes, you're in the right place. Today's guest is Health Service Journal senior correspondent Emily Townsend. In her current role, Emily covers topics such as autism and neurodivergence, to name a couple. She also has won big at the British Journalism Awards in the Specialist Journalism category for a great range of stories tackling tough subjects. She's picked up bylines at The Independent, South West Londoner, and The Guardian. So today, we're looking to understand the health and science journalism sphere a little bit more, and a bit more about Emily's pathway into the industry. Welcome to the How to Be a Journalist podcast, Emily. How are you doing today?
yeah, great. Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, of course. So give me a little bit of an understanding of what you've been up to the last couple of days or so at work. How has it been?
Essentially, if you want to kind of look at a day-to-day, it can vary. So health journalism is really interesting because there's always something happening. There's definitely a very big link to politics. So one day you might be listening to a health and social care committee parliamentary session. You might be sort of covering some of the stuff that big name NHS England directors will be saying in those sessions. We often will take the kind of most interesting line. So HSJ in general is very much kind of like a management. So we cater for managers and NHS managers, and they are sort of band 8 NHS and above. So what that essentially means is that we have to find the most interesting angle for them. So instead of the kind of most interesting for the public, it's very much like, okay, these people are very important in the NHS. They set policy, they run hospitals. What is going to be the most interesting line from committee? So what do they want to hear? They want to know what their boss is. So Amanda Pritchard, obviously she's now departing, but you've got the really kind of big name people, Wes Streeting, Health and Social Care Secretary. You want to know what he is saying and what that means for them. So one day we might be covering that. The next day we might be going to meet a contact, so a whistleblower who might lift the lid on some pretty awful practices in their organisation. And obviously it's really important to kind of keep them as anonymous as possible, but it may be kind of going for a coffee with them and building a relationship. And then you may also have, so it's very varied. There's sort of very interesting job because there is so much that you can cover. So it will also be meeting a chief executive of the hospital, and at HSJ, biggest and most important thing is making contacts and keeping those contacts and keeping up the relationship with them. So we do have very powerful people that we speak to, but it's making sure that they have the confidence to share information with you, but also they're able to speak publicly. And quite a lot of our biggest stories are chief executives who are speaking out about a particular problem at the hospitals, like whether it's finance, patient safety. So my brief is patient safety. So I cover maternity, whistleblowers, regulation of managers, various like children's care. It can really vary, and it is a very interesting brief. And it's very important as well. I really do try to kind of hold the people that we are speaking to account, so the hospitals that we cover to account, but also protecting people who speak to us and give us the information is really vital.
So could you tell me a little bit more about the intersection between science and politics and the way that you're able to build those connections? So is it because Health Service Journal is very much an established brand that's been around for a long time reporting on a certain story? Or in your role, how do you build those contacts to get those stories that you're able to get?
Yeah, so I'll take the first question about sort of how does sort of health interact with politics. So it is by nature, obviously the NHS is a huge part of social life, and it, everybody uses it, everyone is born into it, and obviously you have the rise of private healthcare at the moment, but the NHS is a huge part of everybody's lives really, and it is intrinsically linked to politics in that sense. So there will be lots of policies set by Wes Streeting, and at the moment he's currently dismantling NHS England, which is a huge organisation that set various different targets for hospitals to meet. So the A&E target, that all sort of comes top down from them. So it's really important that, what Wes Streeting says and what he does in his department has a huge impact on the public, but it also has a huge impact on hospitals and how they are run. And it's not just hospitals, it's also integrated care boards, which is probably one of the lesser, people don't really know much about them, 42 ICBs that set policy for health in their area. So we also look at the leadership of those as well. We look at the finance problem. So you've got the NHS is £7 billion in debt. How does that get resolved? How does that impact patients, but also how does it impact managers and what they have to do day to day? Because, I think we reported recently that cancer services are having to be cut back because of the fact that there's this £7 billion deficit. So I think it's a huge issue. I think in my brief in particular, patient safety, it is a little bit more looking at how it impacts patients. And we also cover a regional patch. So I cover, for instance, probably upwards of 20 hospitals. And we have to sort of tune into their meetings every time they hold one, and sometimes we'll get some really interesting nuggets, and there'll be little pockets of issues in trust, and there's been various different stories, consultants really unhappy about things, and a lot of those stories are built from, which kind of leads into your second question, which is making contact. So that is the most important thing, I would say, for my job and for health journalism in general, and perhaps science too, is building contacts and maintaining those relationships, because without them, I would not have had the majority of the stories that I have reported on. I was told, right, you now need to go and make contacts in your area. So for instance, I've got a West Midlands regional patch. It was going and meeting the chief executives on those patches, but also speaking to the people that work in the trust. So, the people that know what's going on the ground, making sure that I'm really kind of integrated in that. And it's the way I make them as well is sort of different. So it's, there are different methods of doing so. So we have a lot of events at HSJ where we host events, but we also go to events. So it's speaking to people when you're there and making contacts, trying to get their phone numbers, etc. But it's also slipping into people's DMs on Twitter and stuff like that. So there's various ways you can try, and perhaps if you see somebody who's quite vocal about a particular subject on Twitter, it's trying to get in touch with them and building up a relationship.
So then, could you tell me a little bit more about the audience that HSJ serve?
Yeah, so it's actually probably because HSJ stories do get picked up by quite a lot of national newspapers, and they're run by quite a lot of radio stations, etc. It is a bit of a common misconception that actually we're a public-facing organisation. We're not really. So as much as it's important that the public understands, and we hold managers to account for our publication, it is essentially for NHS managers. So anyone who is band 8 and above, so kind of senior nurses, senior doctors, they will subscribe to HSJ and they'll pay a subscription, and that will be how they receive their news. I would say it's predominantly NHS managers, so various form, and chief executives, sort of board members at the biggest organisations, but also NHS England, kind of, the big wigs really, who do read HSJ. And Wes Streeting says that he reads HSJ. I'm not sure how often he does that, and it may just be him saying that, but it is important, I think, that it's sort of the higher level management of the NHS predominantly. There's also sub-social care, and also the one organisation that I cover, which is in a lot of turmoil at the moment, but it's very important, is the Care Quality Commission, and they are like regulators of the NHS, and a lot of their employees are reading our stories as well. So
how did you go about picking up your specialty?
So I started out in local journalism, as I said. So during the pandemic, to be honest, it was a pandemic thing, really. So I was in a role of investigations correspondent in my last 2 years at Archant. So I reported for the East Anglian Daily Times and Eastern Daily Press, and we were part of quite a small team, investigations team, which essentially we were called upon to try and dig into some of the data for COVID. So we were trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense to us for the general public who lived in our areas. So it was digging into the COVID data. It was, really trying to understand some of that, some of how the NHS England worked in our areas, but also getting information about care homes and all this sort of thing, which I don't think I ever would have picked up on. I did have an interest in health, but I never thought of specialising in it till COVID. So I do think it was a pandemic shift really that I got very interested in it. And I felt quite strongly because there were issues in our area where I felt like there were sort of cover-ups which we exposed as part of our coverage. And I felt quite strongly that I wanted to do this on a national level. When I went into HSJ, so I did cover, there was a very bad and still badly performing mental health trust in our local area. And I covered that quite extensively before the pandemic and I was very interested in it. So that was kind of how I got into mental health nationally. So it was lucky that the HSJ gave me the autism and learning disability and mental health patch when I first started. I'm now reporting on patient safety, but they gave me that initially because of the fact that I covered mental health on my local patch. And it was sort of speaking to people who were affected by it. It was covering inquest. It was speaking to the chief executives, holding them to account when I was at my local job, as combined with the COVID reporting that we did, that kind of made me think, right, well, I really want to do this. And also the fact that the pandemic opened up London to me as well was quite good because I live in Suffolk. I don't live in London. And there was no way that I was going to be able to work in London unless I was able to work from home. So it's like a hybrid job. But yeah, HSJ allows me to kind of access London in a way that I was never going to be able to before.
So essentially, your time at Archant was almost the precursor to your current role at HSJ and taught you valuable lessons that still seem to be applicable to your career right now.
Definitely.
So then
Yeah.
that obviously works as a good segue into, tell us a little bit more about your time at Archant. You started off as an intern and go from there?
Yeah, so when I was at News Associates, we obviously had there was a placement on a Friday, and because I lived in the area still, that was my local, and I went on Fridays, and when I was there, I really liked the team, felt like I got on quite well. I tried to pitch original stories, which was something that News Associates kind of taught me to do, and managed to I think I got a front page when I was there, which I was really happy about. But they were really good at kind of encouraging me to do these stories and kind of go and speak to people. And it was very much, especially when I started, it was very much kind of proactive, go out and make contacts, make stories. And from there, I then got a job. I think it was like February 2016, I think, was when I actually got a job. So that was when I finished the News Associates course and I got a trainee job. And it was really interesting. Like local journalism is so interesting and I found it fascinating. There was, I went straight into covering court, crime. We had call shifts that we would, call the police every 2 hours to try and find out what was happening on our patch. And, we would do a mixture of those shifts and news reporting shifts. And yeah, I just found it so interesting. You could be reporting on like a Holly festival in the park, a park run or something like that. But then you could also be doing a really kind of in-depth tribute to someone who had died. So there was so many skills that I'd learned on local journalism and at the Stagnant Daily Times that I kept definitely informed how I make contacts now. So there are in my job inevitably, particularly when I'm covering maternity cases and where people have been harmed, I have to speak to bereaved families a lot, and it can be very difficult for them to approach me, but also I have to be really sensitive to them, and that is something that I learned from local journalism. So I think one of the first stories that I ever did was the story of a girl who had died by suicide, and it was incredibly difficult to do. I only just started, but from then on, I really just tried to kind of be as sensitive as I could, and obviously draw the IPSO guidelines, try and abide as closely to that as possible. And my editors were really supportive. And from then on, that was how I managed to do it, and it was very successful. Families were very happy with it. So it was one of those things where I have built skills and experience up at local journalism and at a local paper, which have now translated into my national career, and that they are really, really important. I still apply the skills that I learned during that time now, and is also the same with contacts. Making sure that they can trust you is huge, is particularly when you've got somebody who's going to leak you really sensitive information that could, wreck their reputation and wreck their trust reputation. But they have to trust you to handle that information, and that you will not identify them as well. So I think that's really crucial, and that's a skill that I learned. Well, both at News Associates, obviously the foundation of it, but also going on to local journalism was kind of how I learned that. And in terms of sort of rising up through the ranks, so from then I really liked editing. So I feel like I went up very, very quickly, probably because I felt like I really like kind of managing other people. So I think at one point I was in charge of sort of 20 other reporters there, and I think that was at the time of moving towards into the pandemic. So it was really kind of intense and challenging, but also really interesting. So I used to go into the news meetings and I would set so we had 4 editions. I would choose what was going to run as a splash for 4 dailies, but I'd also choose what was going to run, and I'd pitch stories to the news editors essentially and say, right, well, essentially was a news editor, pitching it to the editor and saying, look, like these are the stories of the day. This is how we're going to progress them. This is where we're getting pictures from. This is how we're going to do this, etc. And that was very much heavily based around a print product, but also we used to model around spikes in web traffic as well. So we were just kind of, I imagine it's changed quite a lot since then. And HSJ is different in that, like, we run a newsletter model. So it's from AM and PM. So we send out a morning newsletter, an evening newsletter, and we have breaking newsletters throughout the day. So it is different. But in my current role, I'm senior correspondent and I edit in that capacity as well. So, and as much as I don't have managerial responsibility, I do kind of oversee correspondence work, and I will sometimes sort of send them and say, oh, could you please run this story or whatever. So I still have the same skills that I developed at Archant, and the responsibilities that I had there, I've carried them over into HSJ, but obviously I've worked my way up here and I've just recently been promoted. So that's been a role that I've been in for a short while, but I'm enjoying it.
Do you have any tips for like young journalists in building that confidence to be able to run a team? Is it something that necessarily comes innately to a person, or is it something that you learn through confidence and belief within yourself?
So I think a lot of it actually came from student journalism. So I was very active at university, and also like when I was at News Associates, kind of doing some student journalism, and I think collaborating with like-minded people and having a little bit of responsibility there. So for instance, we each had our own, like when I was at university, we each had like our own section that we ran. Within that, I was sort of editing as part of it, and you would allocate tasks to people, but you'd also be kind of working alongside like-minded people. And I think when you are, it was the same at News Associates really, when I sort of stepped up to there was sort of, it was very interesting kind of environment to be in, because I think it's perhaps less of a sort of belief in yourself, because to be honest, I still don't have much self-belief. You find in newsrooms, I think, that lots of people who work with you will be like-minded, and I think you have to learn from them as well. Like, everybody has a different background, everyone has different experience. So when I went into local journalism, there were lots of people that didn't go to university, there were lots of people that developed their skills in different areas, and I found that really interesting because they would bring different perspectives to stories, and that was how they collaborated. And I think the reason why I kind of climbed the way I did was just because I put 100% into the work that I did, but also I wanted to find the best in others as well. So it wasn't just kind of, obviously I wanted to do my best, but I tried to kind of pinpoint what my colleagues were bringing to the table as well. And I think that that's helped to kind of boost me up a little bit, because perhaps I'm looking at other people and I'm sort of saying, oh, could you do this or whatever. I don't think you kind of go into a newsroom and you're like, right, I think you could do this, so I'm going to tell you what to do type thing. But I think because I was pitching my ideas, but I was also saying, oh, well, this person could perhaps collaborate with me and do this. And I was suggesting things, kind of went in and tried to suggest ideas. I probably overworked myself doing that, but at the same time, I think it helped me to climb up the ladder perhaps a little bit faster. And so I'd probably say to people, be looking at how your colleagues can shine as well. And that's how I tried to look at the potential in others to help the story forward. Or I looked at them and I thought, oh, you're good at this. Can you help me do this? It wasn't like I was bossing them about, but it was kind of like, oh, I think you'd be good at doing this. So could you help me to do it? And then people recognized that in me, I think. And they were like, oh, she's quite perceptive. She knows what she's doing. Perhaps she might be able to have a little bit more responsibility.
So in terms of the type of stories that you pitched that were outside of the box, could you give us a little bit of an understanding into how you were perceptive?
Yeah, so I think perhaps if you're looking at, I'm just trying to think of an example when I was at News Associates and doing my placement at the Saturday Day Times and Ipswich Star. So I think the reason why I got ahead and perhaps got a job there is that I was pitching ideas that perhaps, so for instance, now it is quite easy to sort of pick up stories from tweets or posts on X, and it is quite easy to just sit at the desk, and sometimes that is how you have to work because that's how your company tells you to work. But for instance, there was a story which will probably show my age, where they were going to bring in a tax on plastic bags, which obviously everybody has to pay now. But I suggested that I would go and speak to independent shops who would be disproportionately affected by sort of main chains like Tesco and Asda and stuff bringing in this plastic bag tax. And I had that idea and I pitched that to the editors and I went and spoke to them and then got a really good line from that. And it was quite a good feature, for instance. So it was kind of looking at that outside the box in terms of story pitching, but in terms of like how I kind of spotted potential in others working on big stories, like we used to do sort of murder cases and that kind of stuff. And I would, if I was on a call shift, for instance, like I mentioned, we would be doing like police calls every 2 hours. I picked something up from that. And then I would there'll be a colleague who was on a news reporting shift who was perhaps had a little bit more capacity to do things. And I would say, right, well, could you help me with this story? And if you're free, it would be great if you could go down and speak to these people on the street, if they've heard anything, that kind of stuff. So it wouldn't be that I was telling them what to do, because obviously I was in the same role as them, but I would notice that there was perhaps potential for the story to move on, rather than just saying, right, I'm just going to do a story that's 4 lines and that's it. I would then say, oh, well, there's something that you can perhaps go and look at. And I would speak to the news editor about it and say, look, like, I think this is worth following. And I think me spotting that was perhaps something that, signaled to my news editors that I was a little bit more perceptive, and perhaps they could kind of give me a bit of responsibility, because as much as I wasn't like, going outside my role and bossing anyone about, it was more that I'd recognise that someone else might be able to help me with the story, might be able to collaborate, and then it allowed us to explore a much better story that we would have had beforehand. So I wasn't wanting to let go of the lead, if you like. So I'd want to find out as much as I could about something, and recognise that there was one person in particular who worked with me who was very, very good at going and door knocking on, and I would say, well, would you be able to do this? If you've got the capacity, could you go and do it for me while I'm on this call shift, while I'm not able to? And then we'll go from there. And then we got some really good stories out of it. So I think that's probably an example of how I did that, and perhaps why I climbed up the way I did.
Do you think that ability to just go out and really very much get on foot and go and speak to people is an important skill for a journalist to have?
I think it is. I think particularly in local journalism, I think I would be lying if I said that I did that all the time at HSJ, because I think it is a little bit different in that, like, there's a lot more kind of slow relationship building. But I'll say that I've definitely made some of the best contacts by going to events and reporting on things. So HSJ is slightly different in that, I will go to a committee, or I'll go out to something, or I'll go and interview someone or meet someone. But you can do that by phone or whatever. But I always find that I build up a much better rapport face to face. So if it's a whistleblower or something, I'll always try to meet them face to face, unless they obviously don't want to share their identity or whatever. I could easily sit and do a chief executive interview via Zoom, or sometimes it's easier to do that, sometimes it's easier for them. But I do find going and meeting them and having a tour of the hospital and all that kind of stuff is huge, because it shows that you've made the effort, you're interested, they're worth your time. And I think that's a really big key thing. So I will often have days where I go up to the West Midlands and I will spend sort of 2 or 3 days there, and I will meet various people, various contacts. So all the way from kind of people working on the ground to, chief executives and their, deputy chief executives. And I think that's really important. I would say that is still crucial. But there is a big difference between local journalism and going knocking on people's doors and saying, oh, what do you think about this? Compared to, like, I don't do that in my current job, but I do a formal bit, I guess. So,
Yeah.
I'm not doing the same thing, but it's still really important to get out and report on the ground, I think.
And has there been a story that you've worked on at HSJ that you followed from the beginning and really worked hard on building the contacts for it, that you'd like to talk about now, if you're able to do so, obviously?
Yeah, so I'd probably say actually that from the beginning, I'd say that University Hospitals Birmingham, we reported initially that there were major failings and concerns about the leadership at University Hospitals Birmingham. And it must have been maybe 2 or 3 years ago, maybe like 2022 time. And we had heard sort of rumblings from my contacts that I'd built up because it's the biggest hospital trust in my patch. We'd heard rumblings that there were issues. The health secretary was quite concerned by, I think at the time it was Therese Coffey. So you know how many health secretaries we've had since then. You know, there were concerns at the highest level and also at the lowest level within the hospital trust. So and we caught wind of it and we reported in the summer. I managed to get some documents from some contacts, basically piecing it together that, you know, there was real concern about the leadership. It was, I think it was described as insular. From then on, I've continued to report on the scandals there. There's been various sort of, so I think this is also interesting because it was alongside another sort of national outlet that covered it. So we covered it first, I believe, and then there was a big Newsnight expose on it as well. And I think it was interesting to see because you know alongside it, we've kind of got our exclusives, and we've had I must have lost count on the amount of stories that I've reported on this hospital trust, and they've all been quite as much as we covered some of the BBC stuff. A lot of what we did was like our own content, and it was all original, exclusive, etc. And I think it's interesting because I only started at HJ in 2021, and this obviously happened in 2022. And it was very difficult to sort of keep up with the BBC because obviously the BBC team, one guy in particular was absolutely brilliant, but he had been reporting on this hospital trust for about 40 years. So it was extremely difficult when, you know, I'd only been there a year to keep up having exclusives. And obviously one of the most important things for HSJ, because we're a subscription service, is exclusivity and having new lines that are different to what the BBC is reporting or other outlets are reporting. So I feel quite proud of the fact that we managed to have a lot of exclusive stories, despite the fact that he had somebody who was with 40 years experience, you know, doing equally brilliant work. But it was kind of, you know, it felt very competitive, and I felt very concerned that we weren't going to do as well. But I do feel proud of what we did because we still managed to keep up with various issues. So there were lots of pockets of problems. So we reported on consultants bullying issues, made and never events. So there was like a string of never events, which are like, they're basically events that happen in hospital trusts that are never supposed to happen. And they were like wrong blood transfusions, all these sorts of major problems, patient safety problems that we reported on. And all of that came to acts and board papers and kind of building up those relationships. So I'd say that that's something that I've followed from start to finish. And my colleague before me, who was in the West Midlands patch, had also reported on problems before, but it was kind of, this is almost like the tip of the iceberg type thing. And yeah, I think I've won a couple of awards for that reporting. It's that sort of thing I think that I feel proud of, that we managed to get those exclusives, even though we had a very kind of fierce competitor in the BBC who had, you know, a lot more resources and a lot more kind of nationally, Newsnight is a lot more known than HSJ. I'm under no illusions of that. So I think it was making sure that we had the management angle and we had the meat on the bones for our readers that perhaps the BBC weren't able to kind of get, but they obviously got it for the general public. So I think that's probably one I would say in terms of the story that I've followed from start to finish that I'm quite proud of.
Does that competitive element crop up quite a little bit in like at HSJ?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it probably does more so if you're writing for a public facing organisation. So I know that there's obviously there's lots of health reporters on the nationals. And I know that obviously all of us get very similar things. So they get sort of press releases and that kind of stuff. We never report on press releases unless they are like really kind of huge. You know, it would be bizarre if we didn't report on them type press releases. So for instance, if West Street took a step down, you know, we got a press release about it, we would cover it. But we don't do that. We are very much original stories first, because otherwise why would you read a press release on HSJ if you're paying for it and you can read it elsewhere? You just would. So I think that's kind of the element there. I think competitiveness, I think we have in health, it's quite funny because HSJ alumni dominate the health awards. So for instance, Rebecca Thomas, The Independent, and Sean Linton at the Sunday Times, you know, are absolutely brilliant journalists, but they're ex-HSJ, and they have been, the way that they have been trained and their experience at HSJ makes them very fierce competitors to us sometimes. It depends what they write, because there are differences in what they write. So they will perhaps do a little bit more, less sure, but like, you know, Rebecca will perhaps do a little bit more of the politics, but they are fierce competitors because they have been trained in contact making like we have. So I think that they have become experts in their field, therefore they are competition, and I think they know their competition, but they're brilliant, and we are kind of following in their footsteps really. But they're also, I'd say that HSJ is a little bit different because we are quite niche, so perhaps we have less competition in terms of, I don't really know of many other publications that report on health policy for NHS managers other than if they're specialising. So I know that there's GP Press, there's Pharmaceutical Journal, that kind of stuff, but we cover overall health, so our brief is quite wide, and I think that helps us to give us a bit of an edge competitively. And because our audience is so niche and different, that allows us to kind of have that competitive edge. But yes, there is competition nationally, and I think sometimes that does come into play. So, for instance, if we get a leaked report and we know that we have that leaked report, we perhaps might push it out as soon as possible because we don't want other people to push it out.
Yeah,
So,
of course.
it's stuff like that we don't want to hang on to it if we've heard other people sniffing about on it. And the BBC, particularly regionally, are really good on that. So sometimes we will be, if we've heard that the BBC have heard, we're like, right, let's get it out immediately. Let's not hang on to it, because we can hang on to a lot of our stories. Yeah, if it's time sensitive, our editors be like, right, do you know of anyone else that knows about it? Are they speaking to anyone else? If the answer is yes, then it's get it out straight away.
So would you say at HSJ there's a bit more of a focus for bespoke content that makes the subscription worthy for your audience?
Yeah, it's all of it is original content first. Obviously, there are exceptions in that, as I said, the streeting example, but also locally, when you have board papers and it's interesting, then we will want to get it out as soon as possible and spot it. I mean, sometimes you have, as I said, when I mentioned the ICBs, like I'm not sure how many people sit down and read those every month like we do, but I'm not sure how many other people do. So I think sometimes you're like, oh, maybe we can sit on it a little bit. But otherwise, you've got lots of other journalists who are looking at board papers for the scandal hit hospitals like Shrewsbury and Telford and University Hospitals Birmingham. Everybody's reading them, so you want to get it first, you want to read it first, and you also want to get a interesting line that is different to other people's. So if someone else has done it first, then you want to be looking at, okay, well, how can I move this on and make it more interesting? How can I add value? I think that's a huge thing, is like adding value to it so that it makes the subscription worth it, because otherwise they could just find it elsewhere. So it's finding whistleblowers, it's speaking to people who work there about what's happening, it's finding documents, it's trying to get a leak of documents, all those sorts of things that gives us a bit of an edge, I think, and we try our best to do that.
So in the past year or so, you were featured on BBC Women's Hour podcast to speak on maternity diverts. Could you tell me a little bit more about that experience and explain it for me and the listeners alike?
Yeah, so I think this was something that it was an FOI project. So what I really like is that something that I really like doing is, I think we're quite privileged in that, like, my brief is very interesting, it's very wide, and there are lots of subjects that I can dive into. So we've been speaking to people, and there's been sort of rumblings and concerns about this practice in general. So people that I know had been saying, well, when I went into labour, I was induced, so they offered me a different hospital, and lots of people had said it, and I sort of thought, oh, this is quite interesting. And it's something that you have to try and quantify the harm as well. So it's a speculative idea. What we do when we do this is we do a trial run, because obviously there are 120 NHS trusts, and if it's something that is interesting, then we have to know whether it's interesting first, because otherwise there's a lot of effort that goes into emailing 120 NHS trusts, and dealing with their FOIs individually is a pain. So we often do like a taster. So we'll send like a sample of NHS trusts. We'll send 10 FOIs to different hospitals, and then they'll come back, and if they come up with interesting information, then that's good. If we'll have to iron out certain things. So for instance, if they say, oh, we don't understand this question, then we will rephrase it when we send it out nationally. So that's quite a useful practice to do. So we did that, and then I went out to all the 120 because we thought, okay, well, this is interesting. We've got some interesting stuff back from the sample. Let's send it out nationally. We trialled it only for sort of a 6-month period. So I think it is an interesting thing that perhaps, so my colleague who's covering me on maternity leave had expressed an interest of potentially sort of, doing another story about this, because over a wider period of time, time. So it's essentially a problem that is getting worse, that hasn't really been quantified nationally before. And I think that's interesting because a lot of the time we're reporting on targets that have to be reported every month, or they're something that's been set by a politician, or they've been set by the hospital trust or whatever. But this is something that is recorded, but it's not necessarily ever looked at. And for it to work for HSJ, you have to prove that there's some sort of harm or problem with what's happening. So for instance, with the maternity diverts, it's that a woman is in labour and they have been moved away from their place of birth. So it disrupts what they want to do. It can sometimes affect what pain relief they want or whatever. So for us, it was important to try and quantify it and to put it all out there. Essentially, we spoke to various people in the hospital trust to try and understand why this had happened. And then, yeah, it kind of snowballed into a story. And I think what was really interesting about it was that there was national pickup, obviously, which is really good, and that's what we aim for. This is obviously something that affects women, and Women's Hour got in touch and they said they were really interested in the story and going on. It was a really good experience. I think it's get in touch with the researcher, and then they sort of say, oh, go through quite a lot of the methodology and that kind of stuff. But I think what it does for us is it allows us to kind of showcase what we are doing in our journalism that's perhaps different to other publications. So we have the luxury of time where we can dedicate quite a lot of time to these projects, to these original stories. And I think it was really good experience to then talk through how we did that, and also then communicate to the public, so a different audience, and why it's important and why it's interesting. So there were various long distances that women were having to travel. And I do think that this is, it's just the tip of the iceberg. I was offered a different place to give birth when I gave birth 5 weeks ago. So it's like, it is happening to people, and it is a thing that it's a problem and it's getting worse. And I think that it was a very good experience going on. And I think that we are always trying to make sure that we do showcase our stories on shows like that. And there is often a lot of interest because it is quite a niche publication, because we do know quite a lot about our subject that we can go on and talk. And I think for people that are, looking for a career in health or science journalism, that's definitely something that it obviously helps to build your podcasting skills and your speaking skills and stuff like that. But it's what it helps to do is build your profile publicly and to show what your publication can do, really. And I think that it's an opportunity it also made me think a little bit more about my story as well. And it made me think, oh, what could I do better in the future? Like, where are the holes in it, kind of thing? Because I had to explain it to someone else and outside of the organisation that I'm in, and I found it really interesting. It's nerve-wracking as well going on something like that because it's live, but at the same time it then shows that you can do it in the future, so that they'll be like, oh, she's been on this, she's done this, it has worked, maybe we'll pick her up for something else.
Yeah, of course, and a good use of a freedom of information request. When I was researching you as well, came across your portfolio site, and I'd like to read out a line for you that you essentially described yourself as. So it was passionate about achieving parity of esteem for mental health and giving a voice to the voiceless. So where do you think that vocational nature came from?
Yeah, so I think the voice to the voiceless, I think throughout my career, there's been so many people that I have spoken to and I have given a voice to that I feel like should have had a voice in the first place. So I don't like the fact that they have to come to a journalist for them to be listened to. And that is repeatedly, like all the way through, like at HSJ, but particularly in local journalism. And I think a lot of the time you will phone up a press office and say something and it's outrageous what's happened to somebody, and as soon as they know that it's going to be made public online or in the newspaper or whatever, they immediately reverse it or they change it or whatever. And we could sit here and be like, right, well, they've sorted it out, so we're not going to report on it. But I've always been very strongly advocating for, no, we went to them, then they took action. And it's always when they are going to be shamed, or we're not in the business of shaming, but they feel like they're going to be shamed, so therefore they think their reputation is going to be harmed. And so many of the organisations that I've covered, and individuals as well, they are far more concerned by their reputation than they are by doing people right, basically. So I think that's what I really don't like, and that's why I think, as you say, holding to account is so important, and it's something that I've really tried to do throughout my career. But the amount of times that I have had stories where they have then come back at the last minute and changed their minds because they're going to be made a fool of, or they feel like they're going to be made a fool of. And it's not right, and I don't like it. So I think that's where that's come from, really. And there are so many people, particularly in local journalism, because of the fact, I guess, that, you have people that are from poorer backgrounds, or they're unable to kind of access services in the same way. And if they've got mental health problems, they're not listened to enough. And I think that, at maternity, women aren't listened to enough. So I think it continues all the way through my career, but that's kind of where it's come from. And I think that that's a huge function of a journalist, is to hold people to account and to give that voice, because otherwise people are sort of languishing and not able to, they're suffering basically, and that's not fair.
My next question is an interesting one that I ask quite a few of the guests that come on to the podcast. And from your position as essentially a specialist, I'm very, very intrigued to hear the answer. So as a journalist, do you believe that it's more important to specialize or generalize for your career? I'll leave that.
That's really interesting.
I'll leave that to you.
I would probably say generalize first, specialize second, because I think generalizing is really important to begin with, because I think you need to really collect as much experience as possible across as many different subjects. And you need to be learning those foundational skills and getting out there and speaking to people. I'm not saying don't specialize first, but I would say that just if you want to kind of have a varied career and you want to build as many foundational skills as possible early, then go into something like local journalism or go on to national journalism, but be a general reporter, and then find out where you want to specialize. So, there may be a particular subject that you've done a run of stories on, or there's really interesting in crime, or you've covered loads of courts or something like that. And that's where you have a springboard to be like, okay, well, I've done a lot of this, because then you could, when you're going to employers who do specialize, you can say, well, look, I've done all of this in this area. I've covered loads of murder trials. I've been really good at, speaking to people that have been wronged. And, I've got lots of kind of profiles for a crime reporter role, for instance. Then you can sell yourself in interviews a lot more easily, and that's why I'd say specialize second, because then you can use the skills that you have learned on that general reporting, but you can apply it to a niche. So I'd probably say that, but I would also say, like, if you want to specialize first, then do so. But I would say that perhaps for a more beneficial way of getting into specialist journalism, you would generalize first, because then you have all of those skills that you have. I would never regret doing what I did local journalism.
Yeah.
That's what I'd say.
So if an early career journalist had their eyes on your career in the day and age right now, would you go about things the same, or would you do anything differently? And if you would do anything differently, expand.
Yeah, I think I would still do the general. I would personally, I would still do the way that I did. However, I do recognise that it is, you can come onto a specialist publication without that prior experience. But I would say that it will make it more difficult for you, because you would have to then learn those contact making skills. You'd have to kind of learn on the job a lot more quickly, because I do think that specialist journalism does require you to have that laser focus, and you would struggle to make contacts perhaps if you hadn't had that experience beforehand. And it can be a little bit of a baptism of fire if you go in straight away. But I do recognise that, to be honest, if you do something like, if you say you're an early career journalist and you have to do some experience first, otherwise you're not necessarily going to get onto a specialist publication. But if you want to freelance, or if you want to pitch to nationals with things, you could feasibly go in by pitching to a national and getting a few stories under your belt, or you could do that at local, or get some work experience and say, look, I've done this on work experience. You could do that, but I think that there is still, you don't necessarily have to do the local journalism to specialist journalism route. You could work on a national. There's quite a few of my colleagues who have done that. So they have worked on the national as general reporters, and they have really they've been really hungry for that ability to do their own original stories, their own exclusive stories, for the time to do that. And that's what we give them, and that's kind of what they've done. And I think people have looked at them and sort of thought, oh, why have you gone from a national to a specialist? But that's why, because they're able to do that, and their stories still get picked up nationally. They're still recognised nationally. So I'd say personally, I don't think I would change anything, but I do think it is feasible that you could do it without it.
So at this point, I believe that I have a bit more of an understanding delving into the reasons why Emily's career has soared so much. Now it's time to get into the Fast and Furious round. I do call it a Fast and Furious round, but if you want to expand on your answer, honestly, feel free to do so. So the first one that I ask every single guest is, are you an extrovert or an introvert?
Introvert.
And are you a night owl or an early riser?
Oh. I'd probably say an early riser. I definitely get the most work done.
Okay. Who would your dream interview be if you haven't interviewed them already?
Oh, that's really interesting. And that's really hard.
Could be absolutely anyone, dead or alive.
Anyone. I'd probably say someone like Freddie Mercury.
You know what? That is really cool, actually. Let's say somehow the universe has allowed this to happen. After this podcast recording, you are going to interview Freddie Mercury. What would you do to prepare yourself for your interview with him? Would you listen to music? Would you listen to a podcast? What would you do?
I think I would probably head to, this is going to sound really, really stupid, but I'd probably head to like a library that has archives of newspapers and, actually look through, obviously, given his dead and given the age that he lived in, I would say that going through archives and trying to find out as much as I possibly could about him. But I think the first thing I'd do is probably see if I could speak to his family, because I always think that human interaction and getting human experiences is really important.
Okay, following up on the music sort of vibe, what is the best concert you have ever been to?
Okay, so I would probably say My Chemical Romance, because it was my first concert and I was a massive emo when I was growing up. Yeah, that was brilliant.
No, I get MCR they're a good choice. Good choice. What are you currently reading?
Oh, so I've read so much recently. Currently, I literally picked it up yesterday. It's called You Are Fatally Invited, and it's a thriller about 6 authors who go to a remote island. It's like a murder mystery.
Very interesting. And with that, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast, Emily. It's been a great episode. Thank you very much for tuning in to How to Be a Journalist. I've been Plamedi Mbungu, signing out.